The year was 1943, and the skies over Europe trembled with the roar of engines and the hiss of contrails stretching white across a bruised morning sky. War had turned the air itself into a battlefield. 4 months, American bombers had climbed into the thin, freezing stratosphere in neat, glittering formations, silver fortresses bristling with guns, flying eastward toward the heart of Hitler's Reich. They were slow, they were brave, and they were dying in staggering numbers. Somewhere above the clouds, German fighter aces waited, calm and deadly, like falcons circling prey. Among those falcons were men whose names were whispered with awe and dread: Gunther Rall, a natural predator with a grin like a wolf's; Erich Hartmann, still young but already legendary, a man who could smell fear through radio static; and countless other Luftwaffe veterans who had honed their crafts in Spain, Poland, and the Blitzkrieg. These pilots flew machines that seemed to embody menace: the Messerschmitt Bf 109 with its sharp needle nose and wicked climb, and the Focke-Wulf FW 190, muscular and brutal, its radial engine snarling as it tore through bomber formations like a shark through a shoal. By 1943, these men were experts in destruction. Each notch painted on a cockpit told of a life ended miles above the earth. For the United States Army Air Forces, the reality was grim. The promise of daylight precision bombing, the idea that brave crews could cripple Germany's industry and morale by hitting key targets with surgical accuracy, was unraveling. Bombers flying without adequate escort were slaughtered. The numbers were chilling. A single raid over Bremen could cost 60 aircraft and 600 men. Airmen whispered bitter jokes about flak so thick you could walk on it, but it wasn't the black blossoms of anti-aircraft fire that haunted them most. It was the sudden, streaking shapes of enemy fighters diving in from the sun, spitting cannon fire, then climbing away untouched. Something had to change. America needed a shield for its bombers, a fighter tough enough to survive deep over enemy territory, yet fierce enough to challenge the Luftwaffe on its own terms. Back in the States, far from the cold and terror of Europe's skies, engineers at Republic Aviation thought they had the answer. What they built was not elegant, was not graceful, but it might just save lives. They called it the P-47 Thunderbolt. The first time new American pilots saw the Thunderbolt, they were underwhelmed. It looked absurd, a metal brawler in a sky of dancers. Its fuselage was thick and barrel-chested, its wings wide and blunt. The engine up front, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, was enormous, giving the whole aircraft a profile like a milk jug turned sideways. Soon a nickname emerged: Jug. It stuck. Even the Luftwaffe scoffed. German intelligence reports mocked its ungainly form, noting its poor climb rate and heavy weight. Pilots joked that if you shot at it and missed, the Jug would probably crash on its own from embarrassment. It was heavier than anything else in the sky, over 10 tons when fully loaded, and far larger than the lithe, razor-winged Messerschmitts that had ruled the air since 1939. How could something so slow-looking possibly survive? And yet, beneath that pudgy silhouette hid something different. The P-47 was not built to win beauty contests. It was built to come home. Its R2800 engine could take punishment that would destroy other fighters. Armor plating wrapped the cockpit like a knight's shield. Its massive airframe could soak up bullets and still keep flying. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns sat in its wings, waiting to unleash a storm of lead. But to the men meeting it for the first time, boys, many of them barely 20, shipped across the Atlantic to airfields in England, the Thunderbolt felt like a gamble. Lieutenant Robertus Johnson, fresh-faced and eager, remembered touching the cold aluminum of his Jug for the first time and thinking it looked like it belonged in a barn, not a dogfight. He wasn't alone. Some veterans of earlier fighter groups missed the nimble Spitfires they'd flown alongside the Royal Air Force. But those Spitfires couldn't fly deep into Germany and back. The Jug, ungainly or not, had the potential to escort bombers farther than anything else America had. Across the channel, Luftwaffe pilots laughed over mess hall tables. They were masters of the vertical fight, diving and climbing with predatory precision. To them, the Jug looked like a slow, overweight target. A flying beer barrel, one ace chuckled. They'd faced the early American P-38 Lightnings and P-39 Airacobras with confidence. The Jug didn't scare them either. At least not yet. Still, war has a way of humbling certainty. The first Thunderbolts began trickling into combat in the spring of 1943. Their debut was far from glorious. Engines overheated, radio issues plagued missions, and pilots struggled to match German aces who knew every trick in the book. On one early escort, a young pilot described watching a formation of B-17s shredded while his squadron fumbled to keep pace. "We were supposed to be their angels," he wrote home, "but we felt like ghosts. But slowly, quietly, the Jug began to earn respect. Pilots noticed it could dive faster than anything the Germans had. In a world where altitude and gravity were survival tools, the P-47's sheer weight turned into an unexpected weapon. If a fight went bad, a Jug pilot could roll over, point the nose down, and drop like a stone, faster than a Messerschmitt dared follow. And if flak or cannon shells tore into the fuselage, more often than not, the Jug limped home anyway. Men climbed out of aircraft riddled with holes, sometimes missing large chunks of wing or tail, eyes wide with disbelief. If this had been a Spit, one pilot muttered after landing with oil spraying from a shot-out engine, I'd be dead. Meanwhile, in briefing rooms back in Germany, Luftwaffe officers began noticing troubling reports. Pilots who had emptied their cannons into Jugs returned angry, claiming the Americans flew on as if nothing happened. Gun camera footage showed P-47s shaking under impact, smoking but refusing to break apart. One veteran swore he'd seen a Jug with its canopy blown off and half its tail shredded still claw for home. To pilots used to fragile opponents, it was unsettling. And then there was the firepower. 8.50 caliber Brownings could throw nearly 100 rounds per second, heavy, fast bullets that chewed through aluminum, engines and pilots alike. Early German encounters sometimes ended with the attackers suddenly on the defensive, their wings peppered with holes, engines coughing smoke. The Jug, once mocked, was proving to be a brawler. Still, in those early months, it was not yet the savior of the bombers. Range remained a crippling issue. Without drop tanks, Thunderbolts often had to turn back just as the bombers reached the most dangerous heart of Germany. Luftwaffe pilots knew this and waited, picking off unprotected bombers with ruthless efficiency. The Americans were bleeding. The Germans, though rattled by the Jug's toughness, still owned the skies when it mattered most. Yet beneath the grim statistics and the desperate letters home, a shift was beginning. American pilots were learning. They were learning to fight differently, to use the Jug's dive speed, to trust its armor, to unleash those 8 guns in short, brutal bursts. Groups like the 56 Fighter Group, led by the sharp-minded Hub Zemke, began forging tactics tailored to their ungainly machines. Don't turn with them, Zemke barked in briefings. Dive, shoot, climb, and dive again. It was the beginning of a doctrine that would rewrite the fight. For the Luftwaffe, cracks were forming, barely visible but real. Their best aces remained deadly, but fuel was harder to find, replacement pilots were green and frightened, and the war itself was shifting under their boots. The Americans were coming in greater numbers each month. More bombers, more fighters, more determination. One cold dawn over East Anglia, as a line of Jugs rumbled down the runway, Johnson sat in his cockpit, heart pounding. The aircraft felt heavy, stubborn, but alive. Radio chatter filled his ears. Wolfpack, check in. The sky ahead was pale gold, streaked with the promise of violence. Somewhere beyond, unseen but certain, German fighters waited, confident as ever. And yet, something was changing. Johnson could feel it, not hope exactly but a hardening resolve. The Jug was no longer a joke to the men who flew it. It was becoming a shield. It was becoming a hammer. It was perhaps the first real sign that the Luftwaffe's unchallenged reign would not last forever. Far to the east, a German ace ran a cloth across the nose of his Messerschmitt and grinned when he heard the Americans were coming again. More easy kills, he thought. More silver bombers to burn. More fat new fighters to swat aside. He didn't know, not yet, that inside those strange, heavy planes, something deadly was waking. The spring of 1943 bled into summer with the smell of gasoline and the low growl of engines over muddy English airfields. Young American pilots, barely out of training, stared across runways lined with the big, awkward Thunderbolts that would be their companions, and their lifeline, in a war fought far above the clouds. They had names painted on the noses, pin-up girls grinning from aluminum skins, but no amount of art could disguise the fact that many of these men felt like they were climbing into a gamble each time they strapped in. They knew the odds. They'd seen the missing bunks after every bombing raid. They knew what happened when the Luftwaffe found you without a plan. Robert S. Johnson was one of them, a boy from Oklahoma who'd grown up watching barnstormers and dreaming of speed. Now he was 23 and about to fly into the teeth of the most experienced fighter force on Earth. On his first missions, he was nervous but hungry to prove himself. The P-47 felt alien at first, heavy on the stick, sluggish in the climb, its massive propeller churning so much torque he had to wrestle the plane just to stay level on takeoff. He missed the elegant moves of the trainers he'd flown stateside. But there was power there, raw and rumbling like a coiled bull waiting to charge. The Luftwaffe could smell inexperience long before it saw it. German pilots prowled the bomber streams with clinical patience, waiting for gaps in the escort. When the first jugs appeared, the aces were curious but not worried. "They dive fast," one pilot reported, "but they climb like pigs." Hartmann, already a deadly hunter, later recalled the early Thunderbolts as easy to surprise. For a time he was right. Johnson's baptism came on a mission to escort B-17s toward the Ruhr. At altitude the world turned a pale, icy blue, the contrails of bombers forming long white scars across the sky. For a while it felt almost calm. Then the radio crackled, "Bandits, 11 o'clock." Small black dots appeared far off and then seemed to swell with impossible speed. Focke-Wulfs diving hard. The attack came like a thunderclap. One moment the formation was steady, the next it was chaos. Bombers belching smoke, machine guns chattering, German fighters slicing through like knives. Johnson turned to meet one head-on and fired a long burst. The 8.50s vibrated the jug like a drum roll, brass shells rattling across the cockpit floor. His rounds stitched across a passing FW-190's wing, sparks flashing, but the German slipped away almost contemptuously, rolling over and climbing back into the sun. Johnson's hands shook. The sky seemed full of enemies and empty of allies. By the time the bombers turned for home, 3 Thunderbolts were gone. One pilot hadn't even been seen bailing out. Johnson landed shaken, his jug riddled with holes, a ragged flap of skin fluttering near the tail. Mechanics stared at the damage, whistled low, and patted the battered fuselage. "She'll fly again," one said. Johnson didn't know whether to believe it. But that night he sat with his squadron mates over tin cups of coffee and listened as the veterans, the ones who'd survived a few missions, talked tactics. "Don't dogfight with them," said a wiry captain named Hub Zemke, the kind of leader who exuded calm even when his voice was barely above a whisper. "You're heavy. Use it. Dive when you're in trouble. They won't follow you down, their wings can't take the speed." Zemke believed the jug wasn't a mistake, it was just misunderstood. It wasn't a duelist's blade, it was a war hammer. The next weeks were brutal but instructive. The P-47's quirks began to reveal strengths. Pilots learned to lean on its ruggedness. If cannon shells smashed through the wings, the jug still wanted to fly. Johnson soon found himself landing after sorties with fuel streaming, instruments shot out, bullet holes peppering the cockpit, and living to tell about it. He started to trust the big engine, the armored cockpit, the sense that this airplane, ungainly as it was, wanted its pilot home. German frustration began to show. Reports filtered back of Thunderbolts shrugging off hits that should have been fatal. One ace fired until his cannons were dry, only to watch the jug wobble, smoke, and still vanish into cloud cover. "A flying tank," he spat later. The Americans noticed the shift in tone. The laughter was quieter now. But toughness alone wouldn't win the sky. The P-47's real bite came from its 8 Browning machine guns. Pilots learned the art of firing short, savage bursts, letting the recoil shudder through their bones as tracers stitched a glowing path. One day Johnson found himself above a lone FW-190, nose down in a steep dive. The German tried to roll away, too slow. Johnson pressed the trigger, felt the jug vibrate, and saw his rounds tear the enemy's tail apart. The Focke-Wulf pitched forward and disintegrated in fire. It was his first kill. Later he would remember the moment not with triumph, but with a stunned, sober respect. "It felt," he said quietly, "like ending a man's heartbeat with one long breath." Still, victories came at a price. New pilots arrived every week. Many didn't last long. Training stateside hadn't prepared them for aces who'd been fighting since Poland. Johnson lost friends, men he joked with at breakfast only to see their bunks empty by nightfall. There was a grim rhythm to it. A new face, a few sorties, then silence. The jug could protect you but only if you flew it right, and learned fast. Gradually the Americans did. Zemke drilled his men to think like predators, not prey. Boom and zoom, he taught. Dive from altitude, fire, and climb back before the enemy could respond. Don't linger. Don't try to outturn a Messerschmitt. Use gravity, use weight, use surprise. The doctrine took hold. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolf Pack, became a name the Germans began to recognize, and not with amusement. By late summer, bomber crews were noticing fewer attacks making it through. Thunderbolts began escorting deeper, aided by drop tanks that stretched their reach. Pilots grew bolder, diving on German formations, breaking up attacks before they reached the bombers. The radio chatter shifted from panic to practiced coordination. Wolfpack 1, tally ho. Wolfpack 2, clear high 6. They were learning to fight as a unit, and the jug was becoming something terrifying when flown with skill. Johnson's own legend grew from a day that could have been his last. Over France, his jug was hammered by cannon fire, fuel streaming, the cockpit filling with smoke. He was hit 21 times, canopy jammed, controls sluggish. German fighters swarmed, pouring shells into his crippled plane. Yet somehow the jug kept flying. Johnson, half-choked by fumes, dove for cloud cover and limped back across the channel, engine barely alive. When he landed, ground crews stared in disbelief at the bullet-riddled hulk. He climbed out soot-streaked and trembling but alive. Word spread fast. If a jug could survive that, maybe this machine was more than a stopgap. Maybe it was a lifeline. The Luftwaffe took notice too. Hartmann would later caution his wingmen not to underestimate the Thunderbolt's dive or its firepower. Attack when it's climbing, he advised, but don't chase it down. The contempt was gone. In its place, wary respect. German tactics adjusted, but each change cost time and lives, and time was something the Reich no longer had. For the Americans, the change was more than technical. It was emotional. Morale, once fragile, hardened. Pilots who had felt like expendable escorts began to believe they could hold their own. The jug, once mocked as a flying beer barrel, had become a trusted partner. Crews began personalizing their planes with fierce names. Lucky Lady, Half Pint, Big Ass Bird. The bond was born not of romance but survival. Each mission completed was proof that the Thunderbolt could get you home. And yet, even as the Wolfpack's kills climbed and the bombers' losses slowed, one grim truth remained. The jug's reach was still limited. Deep inside Germany, over the heart of the Reich where the flak was thickest and the Luftwaffe most desperate, bombers still flew alone after their escorts turned back. Losses there were catastrophic. Every pilot knew the feeling of glancing at his fuel gauge and turning for home while friends in B-17s droned onward into a sky that might kill them. One autumn afternoon, Johnson stood by his jug after another grueling mission and watched a returning bomber limp in on two engines, riddled with holes, crew waving weakly from shattered windows. Dozens hadn't made it back. His relief at surviving mixed with frustration. The jug was proving its worth, but not yet tipping the balance. Something more had to change if the Allies were to wrest the sky from Germany for good. And somewhere across the continent, in mess halls where German aces still gathered over bitter coffee, word spread of the Thunderbolt's stubbornness. They no longer laughed. But they believed they still owned the deep sky, the true killing ground. They believed the Americans would always have to turn back. They didn't know, not yet, that the jug was about to follow them home. Winter crept over England with a steel-gray sky when the change finally came. Mechanics rolled barrels of fuel across icy runways, and pilots stood watching as ground crews bolted ungainly drop tanks under the bellies of their jugs. The tanks looked awkward but they promised a miracle. Range? For the first time, Thunderbolts could follow the bombers deep into the German heartland, past the point where escorts had always turned back. It felt like handing a sword to a man who'd spent a year with only a shield. Robert Johnson knew what this meant the moment he saw the modification. Until now, he and his squadron had been forced to leave bombers to fend for themselves over targets like Regensburg or Schweinfurt. Those missions often ended in fields of smoke and empty bunks. Now the jugs would go with them. The thought filled him with grim satisfaction, but also dread. Deeper meant deadlier. It meant facing the Luftwaffe on the ground it guarded most fiercely. The first long-range missions began in early 1944. Dawn would break cold and pale over East Anglia as the Wolfpack thundered down the runways, their Pratt & Whitney engines screaming defiance. They climbed through silver cloud to meet the dark swarm waiting over Germany. Luftwaffe pilots had counted on that moment when the escorts turned back. Now they watched in shock as the flying beer barrels stayed with the bombers, wingtip to wingtip, mile after deadly mile. The new reach changed everything. American pilots, once forced into desperate defense, could now hunt. Zemke drilled his men in aggressive sweeps. Don't wait for the enemy to find you, strike first. Jugs began prowling ahead of the bombers, diving on German interceptors before they could even form up. They hit airfields at dawn, strafing rows of parked fighters, engines still warming in the frost. German mechanics scattered as 8.50s chewed through aluminum and tarmac. What had been hunting grounds for the Luftwaffe became ambush sites for the Americans. The Thunderbolt's weight, once mocked, became a weapon in these new tactics. In a dive it was unstoppable, dropping like a steel anvil through cloud and sky. German pilots learned quickly, chase a jug downward and you might lose your wings or your life. The .50 calibers gave each pass a terrifying lethality. Tracers arced like burning comets as pilots fired in short, precise bursts, shredding tails, cockpits, fuel tanks. The sound inside the jug was deafening, the recoil hammering the pilot's bones, but the effect was biblical. Johnson would later recall watching an FW-190 erupt in flame under his guns, a moment both electrifying and sobering. "You didn't just shoot a plane," he said, "you took a man out of the sky forever." For the Luftwaffe, the shift was shocking. Aces still scored kills, but now they bled for every one. Replacement pilots, poorly trained and terrified, were easy prey. Even the veterans began to sense the odds tilting. "The Americans fight differently now," one German officer warned. "They come to us and they do not break." Squadrons that once swept bomber streams with ease found themselves ambushed instead, their formations ripped apart before they could reach the bombers. Reports of Thunderbolts destroying aircraft on runways enraged commanders, but there was little they could do. Fuel was scarce. Airfields were vulnerable. The sky was growing hostile. Johnson, hardened by months of survival, became one of the Wolfpack's deadliest hunters. His confidence was quiet, rooted not in arrogance but in a bond with the Jug. He knew its weight, its dive, the exact tremor of its guns when they were chewing an enemy apart. On one bitter February mission, he and his flight dove through broken cloud onto a squadron of Bf-109s climbing to intercept bombers. The Germans never saw them coming. Johnson fired first, his tracers stitching a brilliant, fiery line across a Messerschmitt's engine. It exploded in a fireball. The rest scattered, easy prey for the other Americans. The bombers passed above untouched. Hub Zenke, ever the tactician, took the long view. Each kill was good, but breaking the Luftwaffe's ability to rise at all, that was the goal. His Wolfpack and other P-47 groups began flying fighter sweeps, hours ahead of bomber raids, hunting anything with a swastika on its wings. They burned hangars, strafed rail yards, tore apart convoys of fuel trucks. The Jug was proving not just a defender but an executioner of infrastructure. Every sortie cut deeper into Germany's ability to keep planes in the sky. The emotional change among the Americans was profound. Where once they'd felt like reluctant shields, they now felt like predators taking the fight to an enemy who'd ruled unchallenged. Morale surged. Pilots who had once prayed only to get home now flew with grim purpose. The Jug was no longer a joke, it was a weapon of retribution. They painted names on their planes with pride. Misfire, Lucky Lady 2, Death Dealin' Mama. Each name a promise. But the fight was far from easy. Long-range missions meant hours of tension, fuel calculations always tight, and the knowledge that one bad turn over Germany could mean a lonely death. Flak was ever present, black blossoms of smoke that could rip a wing apart in a heartbeat. And the German aces, though fewer, were still dangerous. Johnson lost friends to sudden ambushes. The Wolfpack never flew without sacrifice. Yet even the losses carried a different weight now. They were not senseless. They were part of a larger turning tide. By spring the statistics spoke loudly. Luftwaffe losses mounted beyond replacement. Factories struggled to keep pace. Veteran pilots were dying or captured. Younger Germans, barely trained, were fed into a meat grinder they could not comprehend. And in their place, more Thunderbolts came, thousands of them roaring across the channel like a storm that would not end. One mission in March burned itself into Johnson's memory. The Wolfpack swept ahead of bombers bound for Berlin itself, the Deep Heart, once untouchable. They caught a group of German fighters just lifting off. Johnson rolled into a dive and opened fire. His .50s ripped across the runway, shattering planes before they left the ground. Behind him, dozens of Jugs followed, turning the airfield into an inferno. Smoke and fire billowed as the bombers arrived overhead, unmolested. For the first time, Johnson felt that the Americans were not just surviving. They were winning. Yet amid the triumph, whispers circulated. A new American fighter was arriving, sleeker, faster, with range beyond even the Jug's reach. The P-51 Mustang. Pilots eyed it with curiosity and a touch of apprehension. Would it replace the trusted Thunderbolt? Or would it finish what the Jug had begun? For Johnson and his comrades, it hardly mattered in the moment. They had taken a sky once ruled by German aces and turned it into a death trap. Far away in shadowed rooms of the Luftwaffe command, officers pored over reports of losses and wreckage, of airfields annihilated and pilots killed before their first kill. The message was undeniable. The Americans were no longer prey. The hunters had arrived, and they were staying. But war rarely pauses to let one side savor victory. The Thunderbolt had wrestled the initiative, yet another chapter was waiting, one that would transform this air war once more and decide the fate of the Reich skies forever. The spring of 1944 found the airfields of East Anglia alive with change. The Jug still squatted in long rows, its broad wings catching the pale sun, but alongside it now stood something new, the sleek, lean P-51 Mustang. Its arrival was met with mixed feelings. For some it was hope, for others unease. The Mustang could go farther, faster, higher. It would soon take the deepest bomber escorts all the way to Berlin and beyond. Yet for pilots like Robert S. Johnson and the men of Hub Zenke's Wolfpack, there was no resentment. The Thunderbolt had already carved its legend in smoke and flame. It had survived the storm and taught a generation of young Americans how to hunt. The Mustang would finish the war, but the Jug had saved it. Johnson himself had changed. The eager, nervous boy who'd once gripped the Jug's stick with white-knuckled fear was now a quiet ace with a 1,000-yard stare and the calm, measured reflexes of a survivor. He had seen friends die, seen Germans fall burning through the sky, and felt the strange, guilty relief of living one more day. He didn't boast, he didn't need to. His record spoke for him, but more than numbers, he carried the memory of what it meant to fight in the Jug before anyone believed in it. Hub Zenke remained the Wolfpack's spine, sharp, pragmatic, and restless. He had taken an aircraft others mocked and turned it into a doctrine. His squadrons had broken the Luftwaffe's rhythm, shattered its confidence, and forced it to defend rather than dominate. Zenke was never sentimental, but he respected the machine that let his men come home. The Jug was a brawler, he told new pilots, and we learned to fight like brawlers, hard, fast, and with no wasted motion. For the Luftwaffe, those months were a slow-motion disaster. Its great aces still scored kills. Erich Hartmann continued to add to his staggering tally, but the tide had turned. The Allied bombing campaign, now shielded by long-range escorts, pressed deeper with punishing regularity. Factories burned. Fuel vanished. New pilots arrived with barely a few hours of training and faced swarms of experienced American hunters. The war of attrition was one the Luftwaffe could not win. Its proud squadrons were being hollowed out, one raid at a time. The Thunderbolt's role evolved with the shifting battlefield. As the Mustang pushed farther, the Jug became the hammer below the clouds. Its ruggedness, once a survival trait, made it perfect for a brutal new job, ground attack. Loaded with bombs and rockets, it dove on trains, convoys, flak batteries, and tank columns. German soldiers began to dread the distant growl of its engine. A P-47 could soak up ground fire that would tear lighter fighters apart, then roar away leaving trails of destruction. Pilots adapted quickly, turning their air-to-air instincts into deadly precision strikes. Bridges vanished, rail lines twisted in smoke, and panzer columns scattered under relentless strafing. Johnson, now one of the most experienced men in the theater, took to this new mission with grim efficiency. On one raid into occupied France, he led a flight of Jugs that tore into a German supply depot at dawn. Rockets screamed, explosions rolled through the valley, and trucks burned like matchsticks. He later admitted it was a different kind of fight, less personal than the duels at altitude, more like dismantling an enemy's heartbeat piece by piece. But it was necessary. If we cut their roads, if we break their tanks, he told a younger pilot, we save lives on the ground. For the German fighter force, every day grew harder. They faced death from above even before reaching the bombers. Airfields were cratered, runways strafed. Fuel shortages kept many planes grounded, and when they did rise, swarms of Jugs and Mustangs descended. The veteran killers of 1940 now found themselves hunted, their dominance broken by relentless numbers and brutal new tactics. Some still fought with astonishing skill. Hartmann and a few others would survive the war, but even they could not stem the flood. By late 1944, the psychological shift was complete. American pilots no longer entered combat fearing annihilation. They were the storm now. The Jug's squat profile, once ridiculed, had become a symbol of rugged inevitability. Crews loved it with the affection soldiers reserve for weapons that keep them alive. Mechanics swore by its toughness. Pilots told newcomers, trust the Jug, it will bring you back. Its sheer presence comforted bomber crews who knew those wide wings and snarling guns meant protection. Numbers tell part of the story. More than 15,000 Thunderbolts were built. They destroyed thousands of German aircraft, tens of thousands of vehicles, trains, and tanks. They helped cut supply lines before D-Day, shielded the Normandy invasion, and hounded the retreating Wehrmacht across France. In the air, P-47 groups like Zenke's Wolfpack achieved kill ratios that flipped the script on early war slaughter. Losses were still real, still painful, but the balance had shifted beyond doubt. Yet statistics alone cannot capture what the Jug gave to its pilots. It gave Green Boys a fighting chance against men who had mastered the sky. It gave fragile bomber crews a hope of seeing another dawn. And it gave the Allies time to learn, adapt, and ultimately overwhelm an enemy that once seemed invincible. Johnson's war ended before the final surrender. By then he was one of America's top-scoring aces in Europe, but more than that, he was a survivor of a brutal apprenticeship. On his last mission, he looked down from his battered cockpit at a Germany burning and broken. Rail yards twisted, roads clogged with retreating armor, airfields abandoned. He thought of friends lost, of the first day he'd fired those 8 guns in terror, and of how far both he and his Jug had come. "We were supposed to be shields," he later wrote, "but somewhere along the way we became swords." Zemke too survived, captured briefly after a forced landing but returning home a legend. His Wolfpack remained one of the most successful fighter groups in history. The tactics he forged from necessity with the Jug would echo in air combat doctrine long after the war ended. For the Luftwaffe, the lesson was bitter. Overconfidence had met industrial might, adaptation, and stubborn resolve. Mockery turned to fear too late. The Reich's air arm, once the terror of Europe, died not in a single battle but in 1,000 relentless cuts delivered by planes it had scorned. And yet, in the final days of the war, as American pilots flew low over shattered cities and surrendered airfields, there was no gloating. There was only relief, and a quiet understanding of what it had cost. The Jug's victory was built on courage, blood, and persistence, not glamour. Still, history remembers. The P-51 would earn headlines as the elegant war winner, but among those who flew, the Thunderbolt remained something else entirely, the workhorse that turned fear into fighting spirit, the underestimated brute that changed a war. Robert S. Johnson would later stand beside a restored Jug in peacetime, running a hand along its thick fuselage. "They laughed at her," he said softly, "but she brought us home." Behind him, the big radial engine was silent, but one could almost hear its old growl, feel the weight of its presence over a Europe once full of smoke. War had begun with the Luftwaffe laughing at a flying barrel. It ended with that same barrel turning the sky into a trap no German pilot could escape. And somewhere, in the quiet after victory, those who survived understood a truth older than any machine. Underestimating an opponent is the first step toward defeat.